Continuing with the exploration of deep order, I'm going to share some thoughts on the nature of leadership. Now, we had explored deep order as a wedge of causality bound by fractal time and differentiated space. And within this wedge, we had arrived at the hypothesis that our organizational and system models can be enhanced by considering this different nature of time and this different nature of space that provide the basis of a much deeper order that exists behind things. When we considered fractal time, we arrived at the conclusion that time goes through set phases, and these phases are differentiated by the physical, vital, and mental subphases. And a metaphor for this progress through time is captured by the growth of a seed into a flower. Similarly, when we consider differentiated space, we arrived at the conclusion that there is a fullness behind every point in space, and this fullness is a function of a fourfold order, if you will, and we can think of these four folds as being omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnicaring. When we consider the nature of development within this wedge of causality, we therefore have a fullness behind every possible emergence, and as the emergence occurs, there's a passage in time through the phases that appear in fractal time. And once development has proceeded far enough, there's the emergence of the aspect of fullness that had underlined this initial emergence. Now, if we deconstruct, or if we look at this particular development, this model of development, we can see that there are several different types of leadership that are inherent in each phase of this development. So there's deconstructing the flower, if you will. There's the physical phase. So there's a physical kind of leadership in which there's an expertise in maintaining the status quo. There's a second type of leadership which is more experimental and easily moves away from set boundaries to consider other possibilities. There's a third kind of leadership which has to do with the mental orientation, so a lot more planning, rationalizing, setting goals. There's a fourth kind of leadership in which something of the fullness behind this particular strand of development emerges. And so one aspect of that fourfold order may come out in more prominence, and we had talked about this in the birth of force. There's a further type of leadership in which there's an integration, so you have a leader who is able to integrate in many different kinds of leaderships. We have a further leadership now as we consider this wedge of causality, and we can refer to this leadership, this kind of leadership, as contextual leadership. And here the context of the particular wedge being developed, the causal wedge being developed, is front and center in the consciousness of the leader. And so there's a leader who summarizes that particular integrated development within the context of the development that needs to occur within a wedge of causality. So it's a much more macro kind of leadership. And then I would say that there's yet another kind of leadership, and this one is, I'd say, very, very exceptional and rare, is where you have a wedge of causality, and it may be a much larger wedge of causality, and you have this integrated leadership, but there's also a full awareness of the layer underneath or underlying from which everything emerges. And this is not just an additive function, but there's a multiplicative function here, so that this kind of leader is aware of what's happening all around them and what the purpose of everything is that emerges in time. So that's why I call it a very rare kind of leadership. So we have a spectrum of leadership here, 7 types, and there are perhaps many other gradations within it, but these are 7 main types. And if we begin to think about the necessity to move from one type to the other, then we can see that a leader who functions, who's an expert at maintaining the status quo, will at some point, out of necessity, need to move to this kind of leadership, or this kind of leadership will have to become prevalent as boundaries break down and conditions change. So remember, this is the experimentative leadership, and then similarly, experimentative leadership can result in a lot of divergent or interacting or even chaotic lines, and so it becomes necessary to have a leader who can rationalize, plan, and set goals. However, when we look at the function of rationality, or the way rationality plays out, we'll see that it is still possible to have many, many divergent rationalities that don't meet, and so again we may arrive at some kind of chaos, and so another kind of leadership becomes necessary, and that is where the fullness of personality emerges and becomes the organizing feature around which things happen. And similarly, we can find that there would still be a bias in development, or a lopsided development, and therefore a more integrative leadership is needed, in which all the different possibilities are aligned around that deeper order or possibility. And similarly, we'll find that even this proves to be inadequate, and we need that contextual leadership. And similarly, at the highest end of the spectrum, we need this very, very conscious leadership that's aware of everything that's developing and why it's developing and what the overall need for development within any wedge of causality is. So if you were to map this spectrum of leadership against effectiveness, and just using the notion of effectiveness very, very broadly at this point, we can probably state that the effectiveness of the first 3 kinds of leadership is slight, and then it begins to become more and more effective, and there's a huge development or a quantum leap in effectiveness as we get to these higher, the 6th and 7th stages. So we can see that if we ask ourselves, where are we right now, then certainly I would say that there's a very high incidence of this kind of leadership. There's a high incidence of this, also a relatively high incidence of this, though less as compared to these two. Even less of this. This kind of leadership may happen just in a few pockets, and these are very rare. This is a rare leadership, and this perhaps there are only a few instances in history, one could say. So, in terms of all our efforts at leadership, I would say that right now we are just here in terms of effectiveness of leadership, and therefore many of the problems that we are faced with, or many of the opportunities, lack sufficient leadership in order to really get to the flowering that's possible. But the good news is that there's a lot more that is possible were we to make that leap between this kind of leadership, the flowering, and moving to fullness and contextual leadership. So there's a huge possibility in development, in leadership, in what our organizations can become, were this leap to be made.